So, okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our online event. We are very happy to see you all here. Our event is called Interactivism in Perspective, celebrating Mark Pickard's contribution to the psychology and philosophy of the whole person. We worked for many months preparing for this event, so it is really a great thrill for us to see so many of you with us here today. And I'll say, first of all, something about the structure of the conference for those of you who, all the information is on the website. There's a good website, so you can consult it there. But essentially, this is a 3-days event. Today is the first day, so it will go throughout the weekend. We were fortunate to assemble an excellent cadre of scholars. In fact, once we started and to call people and so, well, we were so surprised that things are going so well. Here is Milikan, here is Hato, here is, this and that. So we thought we are invincible. We thought maybe we'll go big and go to Hollywood, invite Keanu Reeves or somebody. It was really going well. So we are really pleased to have such excellent scholars with us, and thank you really for your consent and participation. And we have all of these scholars. Essentially, what is common, the common theme is that we all wish to discuss and debate and share ideas and topics and questions that are all relevant in some ways to issues that are prominent in Mark Pickard's work, in his work over the years, which is what we are celebrating. That's the context. And those topics are reflected in the structure of the event. So the first day, we call it perspectives. That will include the 3 panels. The topics of the panels are representation, which will start soon, normativity, follows, and then language, all with high caliber scholars. Again, we are very happy to have you here with us. Tomorrow on day 2, we're going to have what we call a reflective mode, let's say. What will be unique there is that most of the speakers are longtime fellow travelers of Pickard, and they will reflect on the interactivist framework and hopefully bring us very interesting perspectives. So something to look forward to tomorrow. And finally, on the 3rd day, we call it prospective, or essentially it will involve mostly younger scholars, which will bring us fresh insights into the interactivist research framework and into a bunch of questions, of course, with a wider appeal perhaps, but that are related thematically. Now I want to say something about our protagonist here, about Mark. You know the saying, right, about someone who's a philosopher's philosopher. I think that reflects very well on Mark. Those who knows him knows that he's a thinker's thinker. The way he's been threading has not always been mainstream, but those who got to know him were influenced deeply. And another very interesting theme, or another interesting aspect about perhaps Mark's character, is that I think over the years he inspired many young scholars who were really, yes, in some sense, attached and inspired and benefited benefited very kindly as well from his ability to contribute from his knowledge. And that includes myself. I mean, I think it was about maybe 20 years, I guess, Mark. I was a student in Canada, and I went down all the way from Canada to Pennsylvania to meet Mark. Spent a wonderful 2 days. And I believe there are many other people that have similar experiences. And so this is part of what we are celebrating, essentially. Our thanks and our appreciations And speaking about thanks, I also like, of course, to thank all of you, all the wonderful participants, the speakers, also, of course, the audience, all those who helped in preparing and doing the recordings, and a lot of work that went prior to this event, really up until a few days ago. And of course, I want to finally thank Mark again for your willingness also to spend a lot of time on, again, recording and participating and spending all of this effort in ensuring that this event goes the best way. And of course, to my collaborators in the organizing committee, to Jed Allen, who's essentially been our czar and coordinator, presiding over, managing the activities. To Robert Miuski, who's been really all around extraordinaire, doing work quietly and efficiently everywhere. I can hardly think of anyone who worked harder than he did. To Adrian Fraser, who's our computer whiz and constructed a wonderful website for us and really did incredible work. Thank you. And to Uz Ardan, who as well did some very incredible work in presiding over the reading group that many of you who participated knows how well that contributed to the event, and also in registration and other technical issues. So thank you all very much, and let's start and enjoy. Okay, so our first panel is the representation panel. I suppose we can, without further ado, begin with that. The structure is going to be this. For the next hour, right, the next 60 minutes, we are going to hear our four speakers. Each one of you, each panelist, will give a short statement of up to 15 minutes. We're going to go with this order, I suppose, starting with Mark, then Ruth Millikan, Dan Hatto, Marcin Milkowski. After this, then we are going to have a panel discussion between the panelists, right, with some questions for me for about half an hour, and then something like 20 minutes questions, give and take, and hopefully get a few minutes break before the next session. Okay, so are we ready to begin? If that's the case, well then, Mark, please, show is yours.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for your kind comments. Also, thanks to the organizing committee in general. This has been a tremendous as well as a stupendous job. And my personal thanks. I'm deeply honored by this. Never would have dreamed that somebody would think of this and do this. It's great. Okay, I'm supposed to talk about representation, so here we go. One fundamental difference of the framework that I'm advocating is that I claim that representing is most fundamentally a matter of having truth value, not a matter of correspondence. And this kind of turns on its head, at least, a very, very long tradition, at least in Western thought. So correspondence notions have been attempted to be cashed out in terms of pointing to the Greeks. Like represents like, those are also the Greeks. The signet ring goes all the way back. Transduction for a more modern version of the signet ring. Lawful relation, information, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these are attempts to account for representing in terms of correspondence. None of them have worked. And I argue they not only have not worked, which most everybody would agree with, but I would argue they cannot work. There's an in-principle problem. And the in-principle problem is that physicalistic correspondence models have never been cannot account for truth value. One way to see this is, and this is actually one of Ruth Millikan's points, the special correspondence exists or it doesn't. There's the only two possibilities. but there's no possible model of such a correspondence existing falsely. And this is really Brentano's point. You can't have a correspondence with something that's not there or something that is false. So Brentano took this as a fundamental characteristic of mentality, the intentional inexistence. So I would suggest and argue for that an alternative, I'm going very fast through all of this, but we'll see how it all goes. An alternative would be anticipatory indications of future possibilities of interactive processes. Now, these are necessary in any agent, any living agent. The agent has to do something. It can't do everything all at once. So it has to have some way of functionally indicating what it might succeed in doing. And those indications have truth value. They're an indication that I could do something, and it turns out that I can't. The indication was false. These sorts of anticipatory indications are future-oriented, not past-oriented. In that sense, they get away from what Dewey called the spectator model, trying to look backwards down the input stream. They're modal, not just actual and factual, because they're into future possibilities. They have a whole lot of properties that are quite different from standard ways of trying to account for representing. These anticipations have to be set up with appropriate contact of some sort with the environment. If I set up an anticipation that I can do something that is totally inappropriate, I'm not going to stay alive very long. And so I've got to have some sort of differentiations of the environment, some sort of contact with the environment to serve as a basis for whatever these anticipatory setups are. Incidentally, I try to cash this out. This is not going to happen in this conference, I guess, but I try to cash this out in terms of brain processes, in terms of what's a term I borrowed of microgenesis. So anyway, this leads to what I take to be an important distinction between contact with the environment and content about the environment. And just to say a word about content, if I have a setup of an anticipation that some interaction is possible, in general, such an anticipation will be correct under some circumstances and incorrect under other circumstances. And in that sense, the anticipation that it is correct presupposes those supporting circumstances. It doesn't specify them, it doesn't describe them, but it presupposes them. This presuppositional implicit kind of a relationship is a bit unusual, especially in the 20th century, which didn't like things like presupposition and implicitness and so on. Okay, some issues. One obvious issue is this adequate? This is a pretty simple-minded concept or model or example of what I would call emergent truth value, but is it adequate to more complex kinds of representing? And I've argued that it's got some powerful resources for addressing more standard canonical forms of representing. One of the examples is the child's toy block, from which I've just borrowed a roughly Piagetian model. Another challenge would be abstractions like numbers. And I also offer a model for those kinds of things that is partially borrowed from Piaget. So those would be responses to the challenge of, is it adequate? Can it really account for representing in general? The model needs a metaphysical model of normative emergence. After all, what I'm trying to account for here is the emergence of truth value normativity. If that is correct, then I need a model of normative emergence more broadly. And in order to have a model of normative emergence more broadly, I need to make good on the very notion, the metaphysical notion of emergence in general, emergence of anything, emergence of chemical valence, emergence of fire, and so on and so on. So I need the possibility of metaphysical emergence still more broadly. And then underneath that, I argue that that's enabled by a process metaphysics. So all of this ultimately rests on a process metaphysics. I'll have more to say about that in the next panel. And it's quite nice that a process metaphysics, in fact, seems to be the best option we've got today. It's logically coherent, whereas alternatives are not. And it's coherent and consistent with contemporary physics, whereas particle models, for example, are taken by physicists to be simply not the case. There are no particles. And again, I'll probably get into that more later. Another question to be asked here is, what are the consequences of this kind of a model of representing for other models, for further models, for further evolutionary and developmental constructions and emergences, for that matter? So, like, what are the consequences of this for perceiving? What are the consequences for cognition, for decision-making, for rationality, for language, and so on? Some of these we'll have more to say about in later discussion. Some of them we won't be focusing on quite so strongly, but they're things I have attempted to address elsewhere. Now, there were some questions asked. Ite, should I get into those questions that you posed? Well,
so you have
okay,
to.
I will.
Okay.
Which questions, Mark?
Well, like anti-representationalism, intentionality.
No. I only meant maybe the first one was so simple that I thought this could be assimilated, but no, definitely the rest are for the next phase in this panel. So
okay, well, I've got responses to them, so I'll wait for the next phase then.
Well, you have a few more minutes. It depends on what else you wish to say.
All right. Well, let me do the anti-representationalism response. We'll see how that goes. Yes, anti-representationalism has become a big deal in the last 25, 30 years. Brooks's paper, Intelligence Without Representation, was an early one, which I kind of liked. Incidentally, I have his original lab report called Intelligence Without Representation, and it is even more excoriating than the published version. In the published version, he says there are no representations in my robots, at least nothing that looks like standard models of representation. He didn't have such phrases in the lab report. So he attempted in his Australian way to soften it slightly. And of course, Australians are not noted for being soft in what they say. But anyway, Brooks, just as a side note, he professed to actually like the model representing that I proposed, which is sort of interesting in its own right. But anyway, representationalism, anti-representationalism has been around a while. Seems to be maybe growing, I don't know. My response to this anti-representationalism is based on a couple of things. Two of the common ones are representation language is a mess, which is close to a quote from Sean Gallagher. So he just wants to avoid the language of representing entirely because it's such an awful mess. And I sort of agree, but it seems to me the response, or at least one legitimate response, is to try to clean up the mess, not just to avoid the language. Another kind of response, which I think goes a little deeper, is a response based on one or more of the many, many arguments that are arguments against what I call encoding models, although that's not always the language used. This is an entire family of arguments, some of which have been around since the Greeks, some of which people have added to recently, Piaget's copy argument being one. If you don't already know it, Piaget's copy argument is very simple. If our representing the world is in terms of copies of the world, we have to already know about the world in order to construct our copies of it. I might point out that Piaget's argument assumes a constructivism because it does not apply to things like the signet ring that squishes itself into a passive mind. But anyway, so there are many, many such arguments. I've added a couple of that so far as I can tell, are new. But anyway, there's an entire family. So people cite one or more or several of this family of arguments against what I call encoding models, and then they conclude that there isn't any representing going on, which has as a background assumption that there's no alternative to these encodingism assumptions. And I'm arguing that there is an alternative, it has strong support, and that the anti-representationalism arguments based in this manner are therefore unsound. They're arguments by elimination. They have, in my judgment, more or less successfully eliminated encoding models, but then unsoundly conclude that there is no representing going on. So let me just move to intentionality for a moment. In this model, content emerges as ranges of implicit presuppositions. Differing presuppositions can differentiate the same conditions. So this sounds like intentionality with an S. However, this is not explicit. There is no description, and it's certainly nothing Russellian. So my claim here is that this captures what people think they want to capture with intentionality with an S, but it does so non-descriptively and therefore avoids the standard sorts of arguments against intentionality with an S. So I agree with the arguments against intentionality with an S, but I would agree that we can have different contents that differentiate the same or very similar conditions and so on. This kind of a split seems to be fairly common within this model, where things that are assumed to only exist as explicit descriptions, explicit encodings, explicit representations, and so on and so on and so on, don't exist as explicit descriptions, explicit representations. But something very similar can exist in terms of implicit presuppositions. So there's a response to issues about intentionality with an S. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Ruth, please.
Just 1 second, I have to. Oh, sorry, I'm having a problem with the...
It's possible for you to we can change the order if it's more convenient for you. I'm sure your fellow panelists can jump in before you. Should we do that?
Well, wait 1 second. Just 1 second. Let's see what happens here. I've never had this happen before. So, all right. All right, sorry. Yes, here I am. All right, so I was asked to kind of give a very short summary of the talk that I had given a couple of weeks ago. So that's what this is, and I dealt with a very narrow subject, and I'm going to just pull out some of the central pieces of that very narrow subject. So what my talk was about common fallacies and confusions that have led people to reject what gets called teleosemantics. Right? So my argument, I wasn't arguing against teleosemantics, but I was barely pleading for people not to dismiss that possibility for confused reasons or for badly informed reasons. So there are a couple of confusions that I addressed that are nearly universal, it seems to me. One of them is that teleosemiotics is a theory about what mental representations are. What's teleosemiotics? A theory of mental representation. But it's not, you know. What it is the name of a theory, not the name of a theory of representation, but the name of a whole class of theories of representation. So teleosemantic theories are theories of representation, usually mental representation, although all of this began with a much broader project, at least in my language thought and other biological categories. The first word was language, but not as when people think of teleosematics, they pretty much think of mental representation. All right. So teleosemantic theories are theories of representation that are built on the premise that representation is a function term, right? It's merely, teleosematics was merely a claim that being a representation is a matter of having a certain kind of function. But notice, you know, saying, well, representations have a certain kind of function tells us nothing whatsoever about what a representation actually is. So it raises the question, so what is the function that makes a representation be a representation? And there's your theory. I mean, if you want to have a theory of representation, and it's a teleosemantic one, it's that question you have to ask. So what is the function of a representation? Is there some peculiar way that representation performs its function? Right. Well, teleosematics as such has nothing whatsoever to say about that. Hence, about what a representation is. So, yeah, actually, teleosematics has been refuted a good number of times in a good many different ways over the last 30 years. That is, one or another concrete theory of what a function of mental representation would be has been shown incoherent. There's one after another. People said, set this up, this theory up as called it teleosematics, and then destroyed it. But every one of them is not teleosematics. It's a very special theory of what the function of representation is. Very little has been said about teleosematics itself, just that general principle. But there have been a few influential objections just to the general idea that representations have a function. Now, the point of introducing or emphasizing that notion originally was that theories of representation that had appeared, there were just a few of them, before the 1980s, had really overlooked a very important point, and that is that you have to explain not just what true representations are, but you have to explain what it would be for something to be a representation, but not to actually represent, to be false. And teleosematics was an attempt to solve that problem. So if you have, if representations have a function, they have to have certain forms in order to serve their functions. Then it's possible for them to be representations, but to be wrong ones. All right. So there are, however, there have been a few influential objections that actually speak to teleosematics itself, and I'm going to speak to a couple. And they are also, these are all that Mark has touched upon also. So I'm also speaking just to some of Mark's objections to the idea that representations, say representations of the brain, would have functions that would be fundamental to them. So the big question would be, well, what is their function? All right. So the first question hits dead center. That is simply, what is a function at all? What is a function? Notice that a very large proportion of common names in any language are function terms. So the claim is that representation is a function term. The language is full of function terms. That is, a huge proportion of words in any language name things according to their functions. So a broom is a broom because it is for its function is sweeping. A screwdriver is a screwdriver because it is for its function is driving or removing screws. Right? A can opener, right, is for opening cans, and so on. Let's think of just about anything you could look about in your house, like a stove, a house, a boat, a chair, a sidewalk, a piano, a book, a bookshelf, a spoon, a knife, a tennis court. All of these are named in accordance with their functions. The dictionary says that a typewriter, for instance, is a machine with keys for producing. What does for mean? For producing. Keys that are, you know, it's a machine for that has keys for, that is their function. It's keys for producing alphabetic characters, numerals, typographical symbols, one at a time on paper inserted around a roller. All right, so the definition here starts by telling what the function is, and then goes on to say how this particular kind of thing, something about how it serves that function by having keys, et cetera, et cetera. So. All right. So then the notion of a function is just extremely common, right? I mean, every time you categorize something as a spoon or a knife or a fork, you are basically categorizing its function. So we can ask, what is the ordinary person talking about when they talk about the function of a broom or the function of a screwdriver or the function of a typewriter? The answer seems to be what they're talking about is what they would put it this way: the purpose of it, the use for which the broom or the screwdriver or the typewriter was designed. What it was designed for. So to place a thing in an ordinary function category is paradigmatically to say something about its origin. Is to say something about its history. And I would say that you really have to argue hard, I think, to deny that that is the root sense of function in ordinary language. That is the sense of function for which other senses have been derived. It's so common. It's everywhere, that notion of a function. Well, you know, what's this for? What's this for? What's this for? Right? That kind of function. That's the most central notion of function that we have, and everything else I think is derivative from that. So having a function then in ordinary speech is a matter of history. And I think that that should be seen as the core notion of function, where other uses of the word function are analogous to that. All right, so Mark, however, says, and I quote, he says, "Far from equilibrium, processes require maintenance in order to be stable. And such maintenance is functional relative to the stability of that system. It serves a function insofar as it contributes to that stability." And then he says, this is the core notion of function. And I guess my question is, in what sense is that the core notion? As it's certainly not the notion, the everyday notion from which, you know, the word function is usually used by analogy or straightforward. So, and obviously I should say that that of course, and Mark is talking about the ordinary person talking about representations. Obviously, what he says there is not what the ordinary person or what teleosemantics means by function. So that's, you know, that's not what they mean anyway. The teleosemanticist though doesn't use the ordinary notion of function either, and saying that representations are defined by their function. It uses a third notion of function, The function of a system in the brain, this is what's been emphasized, is what the system was selectively doing during the course of evolutionary history. The analogy with the everyday notion of function, however, is clear here, and how it's surprisingly close to the ordinary notion of function, but the notion is different. But there's a reference to history in the teleosemanticist use of the word function, but is certainly not inappropriate in the sense that it reflects the ordinary, perfectly ordinary use of function, where what a thing's function is depends on, as it were, what it was made for, what it was supposed to be able to do, etc. And that, of course, is a matter of how and why it was constructed. That's its history, right? Not anything present. Right? Mark, however, and others complain that having a certain kind of history doesn't provide a thing with causal powers. Footer's word, but it's a good one. It doesn't provide a thing with causal powers. And that if the presence of representations in the brain is to provide us with an explanations of actions, say, why people act this way, that they have beliefs and desires, right? Representation. Excuse me. Sorry here. Sorry. All right. So if sorry about that. If the notion function is if the presence of representations in the brain is supposed to provide us with explanations of action of why somebody did something, representations would have to have causal powers. And on the teleosemanticist, if the teleosemanticist relies upon evolutionary theory to back up his notion of function, it's clear that just say that something has a certain function in that sense does not say that it has causal powers now. Right? But compare causal explanations. Notice this is the example that I think is very clear. What makes a smoke detector? What makes a smoke detector into a smoke detector? Obviously, it's history. It's what it was designed for, what it was made for, what it was intended to do. With that in mind, that here we have something that is named simply in accordance with its history, a perfectly good, and it's clearly a causal order reply, say, to why is that alarm going off, might well be, this is clearly a causal explanation. Why is that alarm going off? Because Alvin is smoking his pipe right under the smoke detector. Reference to the smoke detector. Clearly, that's a causal explanation. It's just that in giving any explanation, causal explanation, you always leave out 1,000 things, right? That you assume are in place.
We can wrap it up in a minute or two, please, Ruth. Okay.
Pardon me?
Am
I too long?
Yeah. Well, just about 1-2 minutes.
Okay. Okay. So Mark and others have complained that having a function is a normative property, but that having a history involving natural selection and doing certain things does not create a norm. Well, there's a problem here, of course, with the notion of a norm. Is having a function a normative property? Well, a norm is some kind of standard or measure. If you look in the dictionary, it's just some kind of standard or measure against which something can be measured or to which it may be compared, from which it may depart or to which it may conform. The notion of a norm is not necessarily evaluative. In fact, perhaps the central notion of a norm that we have is that of an average. An average is a norm, right? Nothing evaluative about that. a mean is a norm. But a norm can, of course, also be an evaluative standard that determines whether something is a good one of its kind. A thing is purpose there, and they're coming back to that, a thing's function. A thing's purpose does set up a kind of a standard, if you like, against which it can be evaluated. It's a broom, that means it's for sweeping. Does it sweep well? There you are. Simply what it is gives you a criteria of evaluation for it. So, but Marx says that if natural selection works, then it will have solved the problem of the emergence of normativity, of normative function. And it will have somehow solved avoided Hume's argument against deriving norms from facts. But I think that that's a misunderstanding, because Hume's prohibition was against deriving an ought from an is. That's the way it's usually put. That is, it was against deriving a directive. An ought is a directive from mere facts. Now, neither did Darwin nor do the teleosemanticists think that biological functions are normative in that sense. And so what they're saying is simply that this is just that this kind of function is not normative in Hume's sense. And it seems to me that there's nothing wrong with saying that. I mean, so that's the position, and I can't see that there's been an argument against it. All right.
Okay, so perhaps
So that's it. I'm done. Okay.
that's, yeah, if that's the position. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Okay. Dan, please.
Okay, is it possible for me to share the screen? Because I made a truncated PowerPoint of the thing that I gave. So I don't know if that can easily be done. Let me just jump to it.
It is, yeah, should be.
Okay, so share. I can now just locate the PowerPoint itself. Great. So apologies to everyone who's heard this before, but I was tasked with doing a shortened version of this, and I threw in a few extra quotes so it's not boring if for everyone who's heard it before, but hopefully not too repetitive. So the original talk was doing without content, and since we've only got 15 minutes, I'm going to try and do away with content, at least at the level of, I think, basic cognition. So I'll try to be quick and swift about this. So I'll time myself. Okay, great. Let's move that forward. So I was in the talk trying to peddle a view that I've been peddling for some time, that we have reason to think that cognition is not all of a piece, against some very standard tendencies to think that the one property that all cognition shares is that it's contentful. And on certain standard definitions of what content involves, I tend to argue, or I do argue vociferously in favor of the idea that if content has the standard set of properties that many people ascribe to it, then it probably doesn't arise at the basis of cognition. And I tried to give some arguments in favor of thinking that, which leaves me with the burden, since I don't deny the possibility of content with those properties, that is to say, truth conditional properties and such like, I then carry the painful burden of having to try to explain them somewhere else down the line, all within a naturalistic framework. So the idea here is that if that's right, then the argument, there's reason to think that cognition is not uniform. It doesn't always and everywhere involve or entail what would be called representational content on that stipulative notion. So what's the notion in play? Basically, the one that comes up in an awful lot of the textbook descriptions, where representational content has correctness conditions of a special sort, those entailed by, as Travis tells us, taking things to be thus and so, where for all that things need not be that way. And that's a pretty pervasive, I won't take you through it. I think when I was giving the talk, I mentioned I poured through about 15 of these standard texts to find something equivalent, but you find it elsewhere. And just to give one more, Karen Neander presents it this way: something only counts as a mental representation if it is, quote, used to represent a target as being a certain way that it might not be. And if a mental state represents at all, it represents something in one way and not in innumerable other possible ways. So what we get here is a very standard commitment to the idea of intentionality with an S being the kind of core feature of these ways of representing that's pretty pervasive, I think, in that literature. And that creates what many people think to be a very standard problem for cognitive science, a kind of, now that we're in winter down here, down under, you say the winter of discontent for cognitive science. And indeed, I mean, the way I think tongue-in-cheek, Nicholas Shea puts it, this is just a little problem in the foundations of the cognitive sciences. He says, we don't yet have a clear idea of how representations could get meaning, and when the meaning does not derive from an understanding of an external interpreter. And that being the problem, it gives us a problem over the origins of content or the origins of meaning in the specified sense I just gave. So that's pretty well known in the literature. I take on board everything that Ruth said about teleosemantics. There's nobody better in the world to tell us about teleosemantics than Ruth. But of course, a lot of people have restricted it, as she said, to an attempt to give an account of that kind of content. And they try to use that approach to give it, particularly in naturalistic terms. And here they tend to rely, as Alex Rosenberg here does, on notions of teleosemantics that are tied to some form of natural selection. He puts it very strongly, quote, naturalism's best resource, perhaps its only resource for solving the basic problem of intentionality, certainly seems to be Darwin's theories of natural selection. That's what makes teleosemantics, at least in this domain, inevitable, he thinks. Okay, fair enough. There's been a lot of literature on this. I myself have been attracted to that kind of position to give at various points in my career. But I am persuaded by some of the problems that have been amassed against it. One very powerful problem is well known as what people talk about as the indeterminacy of content problem, and trying to settle this using just these kind of these naturalistic resources. Attempts were made for a long time to determine what cognitive systems, usually focusing on that canonical example of the visual systems of frogs, target by means of counterfactual analyses. And these efforts sought to reveal which items were causally efficacious in the survival and proliferation of said systems, namely which would have been selected for as opposed to have been merely selected. And we get this famous problem that if you try to pick one over the other, it doesn't seem that we've been able to pick out a singular thing that gives us anything like a determinate content that we can ascribe or attribute to the visual system of the frog. So do we want to say that it's meant to be targeting food, but not black dots and not flies? Or do we want to say it's targeting flies, but not black dots and not food? Or do we want to say it's targeting black dots, but not flies or not food? I've been persuaded by arguments by Good and Griffiths that conclude that these proposals are complementary, really, not competing. They pick out extensional features of things that are the things that the targets that flies need to get in their stomachs in order to get by have to have. They always have all those sets of things. Accordingly, if we want to ascribe a content to the frog's visual system, I agree with them. It would be something more like an inclusive list of all of the following: small, dark-moving, nutritious, fitness-enhancing fly, or something like this, if we're trying to specify or attribute such a thing. And I think this is, as I said in the longer lecture, I think one could try to make the argument that this is a way of capturing the rather odd, intentional with an S content of the state of the frog's visual system. And I suppose that people who are persuaded that they need to ascribe an intentional with an S content will be moved in that direction. However, I think we shouldn't go that way. I think there's a more, a cheaper and better way to go, which is to say that we could resist the invitation to make any such attribution. Nothing is lost, I think, explanatorily, if we simply assume that the list picks out the state of affairs in extension that the frog's visual system is meant to target. What that means for me, maybe that is, I think, in when Ruth came to visit us in Wollongong, which was a great moment, she was herself, and that was gestured at, I think, even in Mark's opening comments about the debates around intentionality with an S. She came and she said, look, Telia's semantics in her version was never really committed to intentionality with an S, contra what Leander was saying. And so what we get out of this is that it's very possible to think of this approach as delivering what we needed, but not what people thought they needed, for quite a lot of people in the field. Okay. One more thing that I really want to highlight before actually coming to an end of this. I think we have an assumption that the best explanation of intelligent behavior of many creatures depends on their capacity to exploit systematic correspondences that hold between structures these creatures produce and consume and targeted features of their environment. But here's a conjecture. It seems possible and indeed parsimonious to explain all that needs to be explained about such behavior without assuming that the existence of said systematic correspondences entails the existence of anything like truth conditional content or variant. And I've been persuaded by this for some time, but we assume, for example, that bee dances have the proper function of guiding bees to targets and that they can discharge this office successfully when they're appropriately sensitive to the certain environmental correspondences. We'll assume also that the bees dance lead bees astray when they are not appropriately sensitive to said correspondences. I think that's a baseline assumption that everyone ought to accept. The question is, though, what in addition is gained by assuming that the bees' coordinated activity on these occasions involves the creation and consumption of icons, for example, that bear truth conditional content? What additional work does that do? And for some, of course, that's going to be puzzling, at least if they insist that they should have some kind of intentional with an S content, given the previous argument. So what could it mean, one might ask, to say that a bee dance is true or false if bee dances lack intentionality with an S? What is it that they are claiming about the world that makes their dance false if they do not represent things as being a certain way or being thus and so? Or a different way to put that question would be this, or a related question. It's difficult to see what kind of explanatory role truth conditional contents would or could play in explaining what intelligent creatures do or why they do what they do. That adds anything to the simpler assumption that such creatures are sensitive to and take advantage of the aforementioned correspondences. I mean, what additional work is being done here by positing the truth conditional contents? So I want to compare two different ways of framing this, and I'm going to take from Ruth's own paper in 2020 that was one of the readings for this conference. So in that, she writes, representations are used by their interpreters for guidance in performing functions of the interpreter. If the representation is correct, an interpreter can perform a certain task or tasks of its own by using or being adjusted by the representation to take account of the represented state of affairs. That the representation is correct will then be part of a causal explanation of how the interpreter manages to perform that function. I want to contrast that. All I'm doing is obviously changing the language here, but I want to change the language in a way that doesn't include the notion of representation or truth conditions here. And I just want to show that I don't think anything significant is lost in the process. If I write correspondent sensitive structures are used by certain systems for guidance in performing functions of those systems, if the targeted correspondence holds, the system in question can perform a certain task or tasks of its own by being adjusted by said structure to take account of the targeted state of affairs. That the targeted correspondence hold will then be part of the causal explanation of how the system manages to perform said function. So I think it is important. There was a longer version of this where I talked about the why I don't think this is actually just a verbal dispute, even though I've just made a verbal switch. Because it seems that if we unpack that, the representational gloss doesn't seem to be necessary. And actually, one advantage of going non-representational on this point is that content qua content doesn't enter into the story at all, and we need not be burdened with explaining how it might be causally efficacious, right? It's not the content so much as the holding of the correspondences that really do the work in making a difference to whether the bee succeeds or not. So I think that's a demystifies that process. So that's it for there. If I had longer, I would say how, but I think we can leave that for the discussions, how this might connect more to some of Mark's thinking, because I do think there are similarities here, and also what the positive story might be concerning how language functions in special ways as special forms of interactions, which actually I find very attractive in Mark's work. So I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Thanks very much. Our last speaker, Martin, please.
Okay, so could I share my screen as well, because that should be faster probably. So I'll try to do a 5-minute or something version. Let me see if that works. Okay.
Dan, you need to stop sharing.
Ah, sorry. Yes.
I think I can override this in some way. Yeah. Okay. It should show. Okay. So I won't. So my talk was about trying to get clear what is the distinction or connection between semantic information and representing, the process of representing that is the core interest of the interactivist story about representation or things like that. And I wanted to present some of the context that is important to understand what role it plays in my overall account. And that is via the notion of representational mechanism that is supposed to be a schema, a representational mechanism is a schema for building explanations related to representation. So I will talk shortly about its features. I don't think I will have any time to talk about operations and vehicles. I will touch upon several things. So my goal was to understand how representing is related to semantic information in whatever version you have it, whether it's based on a correspondence idea that I defended recently, or all other theories of natural semantic information as defended by Dredske, Millikan, Shea, Isaac, whatever, Scarantino. There are lots of similar proposals that somehow try to cash out the idea of interesting lawful or less lawful covariations or changes in probabilities, things like that. So it's not the crucial point for me, the difference between those. I claim that representing implies that there are vehicles of semantic information. That is not the claim that vehicles of semantic information are what is sufficient for representation to occur. Obviously not. That is not the claims. But the claim is whenever you have representing, vehicles have to start to appear. Otherwise, those things cannot simply take off. They cannot work. But they also, something I did not mention, but has to be also put into consideration, that the semantic information has to be bootstrapped. Bootstrap meaning that you never get the whole knowledge into your head as if you were, I don't know, swallowing a knowledge pill that gets you all correspondences immediately. But what I mean by that is that Meno's paradox or Piaget's copy arguments are wrong for the same reason. So Meno's paradox is that you cannot learn anything that you didn't earlier know, because when you're searching for something, you have to know what it is. And everybody knows that this argument is a non-starter because everyone uses Google. No student today is able to treat this argument seriously when you talk about Plato. Why cannot they treat this argument seriously? Is that obviously they know that all that's required for you to find a web page that you want to find is that you have partial start. You don't have to have everything in place. You bootstrap this over the process. And everyone also who has used Google for more than 5 minutes knows that over the time you make better choices. It allows you to get better choice of keywords, better choice of what you want to ask, the questions you want to ask. And you do not have to assume that it's all innate, that it's all in the forms. You don't have to look for correspondences, because that's, of course, you won't find them. You will be creating them on the spot. And those arguments, these static arguments, they share one thing. They share an assumption that there is a static structure that is being somehow relied upon, and then you're trying to find something that corresponds to it. This is also the basis of Goodman's similarity critique, or anything else. And of course, in some ways, these arguments would work if these assumptions were correct, if you would need to do anything like that. But of course, because you cannot do anything like that, we're doing something else. So as usual in philosophy, someone's modus ponens is someone else's modus tollens. So for me, it's a modus tollens. It just means that you're doing it in a different way, because there is a way to define correspondence theory of truth. And I will be using representational mechanisms, which is, of course, a notion of a mechanistic explanation here. And I'm also claiming something that these are computational in nature. So there will be operations on vehicles there. And as far as I can see in interactivism, because of how I understand computation and how I understand dynamics, how I understand those things to happen in systems, interactivism is committed to a version of computationalism, in my sense, in this very broad sense, that there will be a certain dynamics that is covered by a mathematical model of that dynamics. You could call it microgenesis or whatever, but that dynamics would explain how trajectories in a system govern the behavior of a system, and that they have also a functional meaning in a system. So they have a function for the system, and that function is important to how things go on. And I would also argue that they are related to how things are represented. So that is, in some ways, there are terminological differences, but given how broadly this is understood in contemporary accounts of computational mechanisms, that I'm not the only one who's guilty for this very broad notion. Gualtiero does the same thing. So I don't think it's so outrageously broad. That it would cover so many things. So of course, to know anything about representational mechanism, you have to cite at least some capacities of that mechanism that should be explained by its working. And I think that at least 3 capacities, these would be functional capacities, are referring to the target, if there is any. Of course, there might be empty representations, vacuous ones. Santa Claus, unfortunately, does not exist. Identifying the characteristics. So I'm actually stipulating at the outset that intentionality with an S is important. So it's by stipulation. If there is no intentionality with an S, you don't get representation. And evaluating the epistemic value of information about the target. So the consumer basically, or consumers, have the task of evaluating the epistemic value. In this case, there is a strong convergence with teleosemantic accounts, because it's a functional account, and also with the interactivist account, because evaluation system error is crucial. But there is a problem that I think I'm not the first one to point it out, because I think it's unfortunately a heritage of pragmatic definition of truth, is that there is a gap, or there's a wedge that you can drive between action and truth. Mm-hmm. And that wedge is, unfortunately, that you could have no error in your representation even if your action fails. So there's an argument by Krystyna Bielecka, and of course you could have an agent that acts happily, but there's something that is beyond the capacities of representation of that creature that happens and changes everything. the representation of that frog does not even in any sensible manner is able to represent the whole metaphysics of the universe, but it fails. You could say it presupposes that there will be nothing like that, that everything should go without any interruption. But I think the problem is that sometimes there could be failure of action even if representation is not wrong. If the guidance on the representation in the system, as it's being refined and bootstrapped over time, is not sufficient for the action to be successful. But also, and that's also important, the action might be successful even if it relies on false presuppositions, which is like the nocebo-placebo effect. You could have lots of success even if you rely on false representations. And that also means that, unfortunately, there is a wedge between the notion of action and the notion of truth. So there are two ways you can make notion of action closer to the notion of cognition, as I tried, or to try to redefine the notion of system of detectable error in a less action-oriented manner as to be non-committed to making those things. Of course, from the perspective of the agent, there might be little other resources in many cases than seeing whether the action actually succeeds. But if we keep the notion of action to external actions, not just cognitive operations, then we will see that also we sometimes try to look at internal coherence and things like that. And overall, I also argue, and I have argued that in my paper in New Ideas several years ago, that there are several of the Tinbergen's original questions, which are of course not independent of one another. All these four questions that Tinbergen had us ask about the explanation of behavior, all of them constitute parts of a complex functional profile of any representational process. So we might be interested in the mechanism, we might be interested in current utility and current development, or its proper function. These are interesting things. They do not screen each other out. And that's why all the arguments, as I also have argued before, that one of these explanations is screened off by another, and that makes another epiphenomenal, they are non-starters, just because these are distinct questions and are partly distinct and have to be distinguished. I also argued that GRT, good regulator theorem, shows that there is a close connection between representation and adaptive control. So basically, I argued that no complex adaptive control can avoid semantic representation, and most of it requires representation. Of course, if you have trivially easy adaptive control, those without any interesting correction of errors that is actually insensitive to semantic information, well, that would be a very trivial kind of regulator, and that's why you would be well off by relying on the notion of contact rather than contents. But if it's a complex one, then I think you go for a non-miracles argument here. I don't think there would be successful action without truth, even though there is a wedge, because systematic successful action without truth amounts to miracles happening systematically. So even though there is a wedge, there is a connection. So basically, it is the correspondence, not structure, of the representation of vehicle that explains successful or wrong action best. But that structure has to be bootstrapped in most interesting cases. And I think in most interesting cases, it happens via anticipatory control. And here I agree with Mark's notion of anticipatory action. So basically, I think that semantic information is a necessary feature of representational mechanisms. You have to get semantic information. It's not sufficient, though. And representational mechanisms are required for any complex adaptive control of behavior, but they are not only agent-bound. I did not include that part because I think those things can be in very complex settings interacting with one another in distributed cognitive mechanisms. And that's basically it that I wanted to say to, as the beginning of my presentation here.
Thank you very much, Martin. Can you please stop sharing? Yes. Okay. So thanks to all of you. We're now moving to the second phase, which is essentially a panel discussion. I just want to say that, well, for the audience, the speakers were presenting a shorter version of larger talks. The talks are recorded and are on the website. So if you haven't seen them, heard them, please take benefit, and you can consult the longer versions on the website of the conference. Okay, so the way we're going to do it now is just run a few questions. Essentially, the format is for every question the panelists would respond briefly, hopefully, but we've one panelist, I mean, one person who I guess jumps first, or maybe the most relevant for the particular context, will respond to whoever he chooses after everybody makes their first statement, and then we move to another question as far as we can. So maybe I'll try to adapt to the dynamic of the discussion, and I suppose, given what's been said, there are, well, maybe 2 or 3 things that comes forward. Perhaps we can start with my last question that I sent to the speakers, and that's number 6 over there, because Ruth was talking quite a bit about the notion of function. So Bickard and several other, both co-authors and independent authors, have argued extensively for the significance of the distinction between, Mark calls it having a function, which is modeled in terms of etiology, evolutionary history, and so on, as in Ruth's and Dredske and others, and the notion of serving a function, which is modeled primarily in more dynamic, self-organizational terms. So, and there's a big debate, as you could have seen, with this agreement over which of these two is more, does better job in explicating representational normativity. So the question to the panelists was, in your opinion, is there a way to make progress in this debate? And I just want to add one more thing. Listening to Ruth, I've noticed that she starts with the case of artifacts as perhaps a starting point. And so I guess another question to the panelists: do you think that there is an analogy between the artifacts and natural systems? Is there something like natural design, which in some sense is analogous to artificial design? Can we make this same logic applies? Okay, now, so I guess we start with Dan and Martin and then Mark. Dan and Martin, if you have something to say, then obviously you're welcome. If you don't feel, then, I mean, we can just, I'm sure Mark would have something to respond, and then maybe Ruth also make her own remark in reply. So please, Dan?
Well, I'll be very quick because as I just tried to argue, I don't think, well, I have no problem with that distinction. And I think there's no difficulty in the same. It takes me back to the days of thinking you don't necessarily have to make or rule out. I think long way back in Ruth's work, we don't have to, it's not a competition between things like Cummings functions and Telia functions either. We can have more than one notion of function operative. And I think that's a good thing. But I was just arguing that I don't think either one of those helps us with representational normativity at the base level, right? I think we need something more if we're going to talk about representational content. So, I mean, that's my very quick and short answer to the question. I think that, I don't think that there's any reason to have to choose between those two different notions or necessarily to decide that one of them is more fundamental than the other.
Right. So we can go with both, Dan says. Okay, Martin?
Well, I can, well, the easiest way to say that is here I defended this view in a paper published 6 years ago in New Ideas, and I defended what I called a very boring hypothesis. Depending on the representation of phenomena and an explanatory question, different aspects, the functional aspects might be important. And on the armchair, you might not be able to decide which is the important one. So I do not think they screen each other. And the whole argument takes 9 pages. So I don't think I would take too much time. But the gist of the idea is that it really depends. Sometimes history is not overridden with anything that happened afterwards. So sometimes history is the most telling thing. So even the long evolutionary history, there is no a priori hierarchy of causes that would decide upon which of this is to be preferred. So you have to look at all these functional profiles to understand how content is causally relevant.
Okay, so our first 2 panelists essentially suggest that there's it's not necessarily the case that there is a clear hierarchy between these 2 notions. Perhaps they could go together. Perhaps it's a matter of a case by case and context. Well, let's see what what are Mark's thoughts on this?
What about Ruth?
Ruth, I suppose, can respond after the 3 of you. Essentially, I take it that you are all responding right now to what Ruth was saying in her presentation earlier.
I would like to respond to everybody, at least briefly, and end up with a response to your question. Let me go backwards. With respect to Milkowski, first of all, in the model that I'm proposing, the basic normativities are not derivative from goals. They're related to goals, of course, because we select actions quite often for the sake of attempting to achieve a goal. But rather, the fundamental issue is the anticipation of the internal flow. And those flows may or may not be indicated to arrive at what we take as a goal, but there's a fundamental difference here. This is not just a technical issue. The relationship between an action or an interaction and a goal is external in the sense of an external to the essence sense, not so much internal, external relative to a physical sense. Whereas the presuppositions, so I claim anyway, are internal. You can't have an indication, a normative indication of such and such an interactive possibility without having the presuppositions of these kinds of conditions that would be supportive. And the arguments that were presented seem to me to turn on this externality of goals. An external relationship you can always break. An internal relationship you cannot. Another point, if the term computation is broadened to the point that it includes any kind of process, then of course the interactivist model is, quote, computational, unquote. It's very explicitly a process model. So I think Dietrich, among others, has tried to use computation in that extremely broad sense. And, you know, that's stipulative semantics, so you can do that. So in that sense, yeah, the interactivist model is a computationalist model. You sort of recognize that we have some disagreements about the interpretation of the Conant-Ashbury theorem. That gets technical real quickly. One last point that you made in your earlier talk that you didn't make in the summary here, that I think is just wrong. Interactivism does not reject external representations, and you made the claim that it does. So I don't know what further consequences of that there might be, but that struck me as a potential problem. With respect to Dan's comments, I mostly agreed, but I would point out that his criticisms are based on notions like icon, necessity of an interpreter, et cetera, et cetera. And those are exactly what I agree with. They do not apply to implicit ranges, implicit presuppositions, and content in that sense. So one of the parts of the response to anti-representationalism that I didn't explicitly mention earlier is any organism that is an agent is going to have, in virtue of being an agent, indications of interactive potentialities, and those indications of potentialities are intrinsically capable of having truth value. So if you don't want to use the word representation, then okay, but that just makes it a whole lot harder to talk about that fact and other things involving that fact. So I agree with Huda's arguments, but there are arguments against explicit representation with explicit structures and interpreters and so on and so on. And I would argue content in the sense of bearing truth value exists in spite of all of those arguments, which I do agree with. And now finally to these earlier points. I certainly agree that there are multiple notions of the use of the term function. Two of them I would like to point out are a design notion or an intended notion. And I agree with Ruth that that's probably the most common and that huge amounts of vocabulary are used in this design sense. And that a design notion makes sense for relationally having a function for the designer. Like the relation between a human and a designed artifact, or if you want, by analogy, with evolution as a designer. But another use of the word function is usefulness. And it's not as common, it's not as broad. But what I'm looking for is a dynamic metaphysics. I want to know what we're referring to, not just what we mean by the notion of function. I was a little surprised, Ruth, because somewhere you very vociferously claim that you're not doing conceptual analysis, but this worrying about the meaning and use of the word function sounds a little bit like conceptual analysis to me. But anyway, so usefulness is one that I agree is not as broad. But I take it to be closer to something that can have efficacy and have dynamic reality. One of the problems with the design notion is that it's relational. It's related to the designer, and these kinds of relational notions, we have difficulty explaining how they can have any influence on the world. So the historical relationship to evolution, I take to be an example of that. And my primary example is actually yours, and that's the lion that pops into existence, that because it has no evolutionary history, has no functions, and therefore no representations, even though it might be dynamically identical to or equivalent to the lion in the zoo. So I want to know what function can be as a property of the dynamics. Incidentally, I might point out that in the model that I'm proposing, it's pretty clear that evolution has to have created these anticipations of interactive, these indications of anticipations of interactive possibilities. That's the reason they're there. That's their etiology. That's their teleos, if you want. But they have not been selected, so I claim, for representing. They've been selected for successfully indicating potentialities. And representation is a further emergent in that function. So the function of indicating potentialities, yeah, it evolved, and it has to have evolved in order to be there at all, but it's not its evolutionary history that A, makes it functional, or B, grounds the fact that it has truth value. So there's one of the, what I claim to be a technical sounding, but ultimately I think important distinction. It is not the function of representing that is selected for in evolution. It's this ability to indicate interactive potentialities. Okay, I have a whole bunch of other notes, but maybe that's a good place to stop for now.
Yes, some of them for sure will have the opportunity to return perhaps later with other questions. Ruth, is there anything else that you, after hearing the other panelists, there's something else you wish to say on that point?
Yeah, very quick, very quick. And that to the last statement that you yourself made about this. So the question arises: what is the relation between something which has a function because it has a purpose, and that has purpose because a human made it for some reason, you know, and the evolutionary thing, right? The heart has a function, you know. I just might want to point out that in language thought and other biological categories, at least, I defined a sense of function, a sense of proper function, and included in that a notion of what I call derived functions, adapted functions, and attempted to argue at least that the definition that I had given actually of a proper function, which covers functions from evolution, it actually covers in the end the function of any artifact that a human makes. So what a human does in certain situations also derives from what evolution, or what kinds of capacities evolution has presented that person with. And given the situation, what happens here, these things are derived functions in the same sense of function as evolution, as the functions that come from evolutionary. So anyway, I just mentioned that I have argued at least that there is a continuity there, that the functions that are derived from people's purposes are proper functions in the sense that I defined. Yeah.
May I follow up with just a quick questions for you, Ruth, on that? So one of the, because I guess some people have it in the back of their mind, and I think it came out earlier in one of the wonderful examples that I remember from your language truth and other biological categories is the example of the beaver, right? The beavers that splash their tail, and that's a signal of a danger, to which other conspecific responds. I guess the dispute here is over where, I mean, you know, so the beaver, that behavior obviously has been selected and became a proper function, but some people think, right, that it's actually that success in actually splashing and indicating that sort of dynamic was already there, and that's the reason why it's been selected in the first place. And I wonder if you could quickly, I mean, how do you, what's your take on that, on this sort of, you know, objection, right? Because it kind of like want to shift the balance back to the more serving a function concept, I suppose.
I'm not sure that I understand the question totally. Let me just say that I mean
does it really become a function after it has been selected, or is it that it has been selected because it was already a function, right? There was a dynamic there that did something that served a purpose. And I guess a lot of the debate is around that.
Yeah, okay.
Right?
Serve a purpose. I mean, there's more than one sense of that. I mean, some people, when you say served a purpose, would say whose purpose? In other words, they would think of a purpose as having to be something that someone or God had, right? Served a purpose in another sense, well, then you have to define, you know, you have to tell me, and Mark has given us another sense in which one might talk about a purpose. I don't think it's the everyday way of talking about a purpose, but yeah, in the sense that I would normally mean of a purpose, you'd have to have someone who had actually an intention, something like an intention to make something that did something, you know, that you'd have to have behind that. But you know, so there are other uses of the word purpose. Define them. I mean, I don't know if that helps, but yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I guess we have a little bit more time, perhaps. Let's go with another question. Actually, somewhat of a heavy question, let's say, but again, it came out in I suppose, in what you were just saying. So I believe this is question number 5 here, right? Is representational content, and again, however primitive or sophisticated, is it necessarily intentional? I mean, that concept came in Dan's talk, and also perhaps we can also connect to this the question of truth conditions, which were also mentioned here, right? Are these necessary necessary aspects of representation in all its phases and all its levels of sophistication, let's say? So I want to ask the panelists, essentially, if your answer is positive, how would you respond to the widely held opinion that non-conceptual content is emphatically non-intentional, right? This kind of view. If your answer, on the other hand, is negative, how would you go about explaining the emergence of intentionally qualified mental states from a more primitive cognitive background? We saw Dan struggling with that, or saying that it's a burden of explanation, right? How could you start from a background in which intentionality is wholly absent and then somehow generate it? And perhaps also, finally, in your view, could the problem be satisfactorily addressed naturalistically? So perhaps we go, let's start with Martin then, and follow with Dan, Ruth, and Mark.
I wish I knew what non-conceptual content is. The word is, I mean, the term non-conceptual content is used in so many ways that it's really difficult to keep track even of the discussion. So I stopped, and I don't know what non-conceptual content is, if the shared meaning of that thing. So I would say that there is some, because of my commitment to semantic information. Of course, semantic information, there would be some vehicles, and they would have certain truth conditions. So they would be evaluated somehow. They have to be evaluated by the organism or a system itself for them to be epistemically useful in any way, at least partially evaluable. Then, of course, they would be presenting, to use Frege's metaphor, under some mode of presentation, not just as the thing is out there. So there would be vehicles that are available, and they are operated upon with some implicit semantic interpretation usually, or something like that. But you could also interpret this in a very deflationary manner, as in mental files, like Reconati did. So it's being segregated. It's some way of actually understanding a mode of presentation, that it has a certain label or something like that. So it goes under a certain category. If that is, this minimalistic way is sufficient for intentionality, and probably it is, because you are already applying a certain label to something which you might apply in a different way, it suffices to say that there are certain, at least this is one property of that object that should be satisfied, that it belongs to the category. But it's maybe too deflationary for many people to understand mental files as involving intentionality with an S. Maybe that would be then sufficient for non-conceptual contents, whatever that is. To be frank, I don't either know what conceptual contents is. So on both sides, I'm pretty bad.
I suppose the question about intentionality makes sense even without getting into the conceptual, non-conceptual distinction. But okay, thank you. Can we? So I suppose that Ruth and Dan already talked about it. So let's let you respond quickly at the end, or have some quick thought, and let's follow with Mark. We basically have only a few more minutes for that before we need to move to give some time to the audience as well. So Mark, please.
Oh, well, I basically agree with Marcin. I don't know what non-conceptual content is. It's defined negatively. And most of the discussions of it assume that conceptual content is some sort of an encoding, mental files, among other kinds of encoding assumptions. And since I don't agree that conceptual content in that sense exists at all, or at least very rarely, and certainly not foundational, it makes it rather difficult to address notions of non-conceptual content. Unless you want to say that anything implicit will be non-conceptual, in which case I would argue that most all of cognition is non-conceptual, because if it has content at all, it's implicit rather than explicit. I would point out that this problem has many, many versions, consequences, aspects, and so on. And one of them is the notion of ground. So what do you bootstrap from would be one way to ask the question. You got to have some ground. So Russell tried to do it as a sort of a logical bootstrapping rather than an action bootstrapping from direct acquaintance. And he ultimately realized he couldn't do it. Fodor tries to do it from transduction and so on and so on. You got to have a ground. And my fundamental criticism of this way of thinking is where does the ground come from? And if the fundamental in-principle arguments against encoding style representing work, then evolution can't do it either. Direct acquaintance can't do it either. None of these other models can do it either. So you can't get the ground. And so this question about intentionality seems to me to be one of many, many, many aspects of this fundamental problem, especially when intentionality is meant in this explicit sense. And I said earlier, a sense in which I think it does not have to be understood that way. It can be understood as in an implicit presuppositional sense, recognizing that differing implicit presuppositions can, in fact, differentiate the same conditions, but you don't have anything explicit there.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Dan, very quick, and also Ruth, just if there's anything to add at this point in the space of really just a few minutes.
Yeah, I'll be super fast because I know you want to get onto questions from the audience. But yeah, no, just to say, strangely, I mean, I certainly agree. I don't know whether I want to. In fact, I'm very cautious about the idea of the implicit presuppositional story yielding truth conditions, the way Mark said. But we agree completely, I think, on everything else. And I certainly think that, yeah, I too have I think I stopped talking about non-conceptual content in 1999 and had the same problem that I couldn't get a grip any longer of what exactly it meant, what was supposed to be meant there either. So, but I do think for me, the burden, as you say, is, I do think we can give it, I hope we can give a naturalistic account of things like our ability to have truth conditional thoughts. I just think that there's much more that needs to be, and this may be the next panel with normativity. I think we need to have normativity of a different type, a different level. And so I was looking there at Mark's comments about language and its special functions, and the idea very much that even if language isn't essentially representational, but it might create truth values. So I thought that was an attractive position. So that's what I've got to say on that.
Let me make one very brief comment about that. Truth conditional talk I find to be dangerous because truth conditions have to be explicit. So what I argue is that presuppositions give you truth value, but if you try to make them explicit into truth conditions, you run into, among other problems, the frame problems, which is the subject of a talk on Sunday, I think.
Thanks. Ruth, please.
All right.
Last words or yeah.
This is a very difficult question for me to answer because
it was your question. You asked me to ask it actually. In
yeah.
a way, encourage me to ask.
Well, because I have not yet been able to get my hands on any notion of intentionality with an S that makes any sense to me at all. As a matter of fact, by my own analysis, looking at this, the phenomenon of intentionality with an S, which is defined in the usual way, that is, where you can't exchange terms that have the same referent necessarily and maintain the truth value. As a matter of fact, looked at very carefully, this is merely a matter of an interesting thing about notation. in the English language and probably in many other languages. It's very superficial, and certainly not anything fundamental. And the idea that there would be such a thing in thought is quite nutty. But then I mean I have to back that up because I have then a whole different notion of what there is in place of concepts. That's what the book, my 2017 book, is about. That we have to get rid of the whole notion of concept there, and if you replace it with what I call a unicept, then you could give an analysis of some of these things. But it certainly won't. You certainly won't end up with a problem about whether or not thought has intentionality. It just it makes no sense in another framework. Yeah, sorry. So I can't really help, right? I'm just very skeptical of all of this, right?
I think some of us will look forward, when if you write a paper about this deflation.
Yeah, well, this is in about yeah, true that I haven't written about intentionality with an S. Actually, I am doing that. So maybe something will come out. We'll see. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, really. And now I hope you're still fresh enough to absorb questions from the audience. I think we ought to give them a chance to ask the questions. So please, thanks for the panelists. And now the discussion is open for questions. And if I don't see questions here, I see Lucas. I will ask for assistance from my committee members to make sure that we are keeping track here of what's going on. But I see Lucas, so please, Lucas Thor. Is your mic open? Lucas, are you mute?
Somehow his microphone didn't work. He will talk from here.
Somehow my microphone wasn't working.
Okay. Right.
Okay.
Now you're on mute. You're muted. You're
Lucas
muted again.
Lucas, we can't hear you. Lucas. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
And you quickly.
Yes.
Yeah, so I've got a question that is aimed at those of you who believe in representation talk. So Dan doesn't count for this one. And it's got to do with some of you have talked about what types of representations and functions are most basic or fundamental. And I'm wondering what you think a theory of content is answerable to. So at the start of her comments, Ruth appealed to our everyday notions. And I guess ultimately that's not going to be what you want to do the work. People like Shay think a theory of content is answerable to the sort of the roles they play in scientific theories. Mark, I think, has got a kind of an emergentist picture where basicness is understood in kind of layers of emergence. So I'm just wondering what you think a sort of methodological question is. If there is some way of making progress, what do we appeal to as the kind of evidential base for which theory may be best?
Good question. Yes. So who would like to respond first? Ruth, is that a hand? Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's the question. Excellent. I mean, the fact that that question has not being answered is one reason people are talking past each other the way they are. But let me just say that that there's a sense in which I tried to answer that question in language thought and other biological categories, because what I did there was to say, look, the notion of a representation is used in many, many different ways. I mean, you know, the maps are representation, charts are representations. We think maybe there are such things as mental representations, language is a representation, photographs maybe a representation. And what I tried to do there was to show that there was in fact a common theme that could be pulled out that covered all of those senses of representation. So I mean, that's one way to go, and it's a way that I did try to go. I tried to demonstrate that the themes that I was pulling out, the way I was defining a representation, as a matter of fact, fit language, charts, diagrams, you know, so animal signals, etc. So that's one way to go. But what I said, I don't think there's an answer written in heaven to your question. And it is causing a lot of trouble that people don't have the same idea necessarily at all of what they're trying to do here. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Martin, Dan, Mark, anyone wishes to add something? Mark, yes. You're muted.
Sorry, I don't know how I got muted, but anyway, okay. Basically what I'm claiming is that the fundamental property, if you want to think of it that way, that the notion of representation and representational content has to answer to is truth value, not correspondence. And that's what I'm attempting to account for. I guess I have a further comment that's sort of a side comment to that, but it leads to it. I'm attempting to account for what I think we refer to or try to refer to when we use words like representation and concept and so on. And the basic strategy is to construct dynamic models of various sorts and see if they can account for enough of the properties of what I think we are referring to when we use these terms to be an acceptable explication of the terms. So it's not an interpretation of the terms, it's an explication of the terms. That is not the only possible outcome. I could decide, like with the term phlogiston, that an actual process explanation shows that phlogiston just doesn't exist at all. Or I could decide, like meteorology, that an explication of the term leaves out a major source of what meteorology used to be used to refer to, namely meteors. So what it was being used to refer to and its meaning was not a unitary phenomenon at all. So it needs to be split. So I'm taking the dynamic models as primary and the usages of the language as secondary. And I'm proposing the dynamic models as theoretical models. I don't know if they're philosophical models or not. They're not philosophical models in the sense of analyses of the meanings of the terms, but they are certainly theoretical models that have philosophical or have to address philosophical issues. And in that sense, they're being proposed in this theoretical sense more than at least an analytic philosophical sense.
Okay. All right. Anyone wishes to add, Dan or Martin, or should we take another question?
Maybe another question.
Another question. Okay. So,
actually.
oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, Martin. Sorry.
So I would say philosophy of science is philosophy enough. That's a short answer. But the other longer quip would be to say we're all in neurids both. So we are bootstrapping all the time. So we are refining our understanding of concepts by understanding how those things connect with each other. So we're trying to make it correct all the time, but there is no privileged point of view, and definitely neither philosophical nor, I don't know, neuroscientific. If there is anything singular like neuroscience, I don't think so. But particular models, their particular takes, they're just partial views, and we have to try to triangulate, find best ways, look at arguments, understand what are the commitments and so on. But there is no privileged view, so I don't think there is any single privileged point of view for philosophy here.
Dan?
Well, I wasn't going to come in and now say that I have a God's eye view after that, but I was going to say that, I mean, I think the notion comes up in different places. The question is whether we're really seeking to understand or explicate, as Mark puts it, an explanandum, or whether we're looking to provide an explanans for certain phenomena. I think when we're in the second move, which a lot of cognitive scientists tend to want to do, they want to provide something that does some explanatory work. That's where I think a lot of the discussion comes in for determining what do you minimally require. And I do think arguments, as I often wheel in on parsimony and other things, are become important at that point, right? What do the theories that you're leaning on force you to accept, and what can you get by with? So, I mean, that's typically how I approach it. So I don't actually, to come back to the way you phrased the earlier question about intentionality with an S, there's something in that related, which was, I always stick with what's stipulated by the existing theorists. I don't try to argue for necessity. Like I'm not arguing for the existence of these things outside of that scope. So I see that's very much working within the scope of what is it that people are assuming when they're trying to do explanations, and then pushing those really hard. So I think that actually is consistent with what Marston just said, right? You have different people with different explanatory agendas. And yeah, we can push them on their assumptions, and that's as far as it goes. But I think just getting clear about those assumptions is really takes an awful lot of work. So that would be my answer.
Okay, great. Well, Lucas' question sounded like the question to end all questions. So my question is, should we do that? Take a few minutes to refresh and start before the second panel, or do you wish to take another question?
I think we're fine on time. We can take another question if someone has one, and then we can still just take a 10-minute break. And we might start 5 minutes late, but we have almost 2 hours for lunch, so I think we're good.
Okay. So do we have Joanna Razicek, right?
Yes. Thank you so much. I've been meaning to ask this question for a long time to Mark, so this is a good opportunity, because when I read his papers, I really agree with everything that he proposes that is going on within an agent. And I still have a very difficult time to slap a name of representation to any of those processes. And I wanted to ask, do I understand the English wrong, or it does have to present something again? Right, represent something. Why does it have this property that this name implies, or is it a presentation or presence maybe, which would be a presence in the environment, for example, or a presence of a condition would be a better name for it. So why do you, Mark, name representations in your system?
Okay, nice question, legitimate question. And it illustrates the point I was making, I think. I came up with an analysis in terms of contact and content, and this does not, splitting these two, differentiating between contact and content, splits out properties that are classically associated with the notion of representation. So I had to address the semantic issue. Do I abandon the notion of representation? Do I use the notion of representation for the contact part? Or do I use the notion of representation for the content part? From a stipulative perspective, I could have done any of those. But historically, the fundamental problem of representation has always been accounting for truth value. And since this model of content, I claim, does account for truth value, I decided to use the word representation or representing for the content part. That's an illustration of what I was talking about before. Attempting to come up with dynamic models may or may not give you a unitary way of understanding what these terms have been used to refer to. I've run into similar problems with notions like belief, with notions like concept, many, many other things in which the standard ways of understanding them, I think, are flat wrong. That doesn't necessarily mean we are referring to something that doesn't exist. It doesn't necessarily mean that beliefs and concepts and so on are like phlogiston. It simply doesn't exist. But it may mean that I have to completely change or change significantly what the dynamic model is of what I think we are using these terms to try to refer to. And I would simply point out that Joanna had her hand up, but not her little yellow hand up. Johanna, is that right?
No, I did have my yellow hand up, but I took it down.
No. Joanna, not Johanna. or Johanna, not Joanna. Sorry.
No, that's just fine. Maybe we can adopt a policy that works well otherwise, that we put a little X in the chat for those who have a question. That's nice. My question, if we have time, I'm not sure. Peter, what do you say?
I thought Ken was next in this question. Okay.
No, so, Ken was after Johanna.
Was that right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, sure. Go ahead then.
Okay, I make it short. Sorry. I just wanted to say, I think there's a very important point of Marx's theory that hasn't come into discussion at all. I think it will come out later on, but he mentioned at the very beginning that the entire account of representation in his sense, which I always understood as getting at something very, very basic, rests on a process metaphysics. And so far, the argument that underlies his talk about what internal means, namely that there is no other way of describing what occurs there when an anticipation arises. That very argument is, I think, extremely powerful, and that should be also in the context of our discussion. It came out a little bit in Itai's question about is having a function or serving a function first. Maybe the distinction here simply falls away if we were to concentrate on it being a process, meaning what occurs there cannot be described in any other way without taking the causal evolutionary history, but also the present function or the present doing, the present place within the system of other processes into account. So my question is, am I seeing this incorrectly? Are other people as impressed by the argument on the panel as impressed as I am? Or have we perhaps overlooked it? That's my question.
Okay, that seems to be a question to everybody except Mark, I suppose. Ruth, or who would like to jump in here? Actually, any of you, Dan, Martin.
Well, I just to say that I don't yet fully grasp that argument. So perhaps I'm not yet as impressed, but that may be because I don't know its contours well enough. But I think that I mean, I'm in no way against the idea of a process metaphysics in this respect. But what I don't see is why that would necessarily get us the notion of an implicit presupposition that had truth values. So I still need to spend more time, I think, before I could see how that argument functioned to get that result. So I suppose that's all I would say for the moment.
Anyone else? If nobody else wishes to follow, maybe we can take one last question. Or Mark, did you want to follow also on what Joanna said, or is that?
Well, I can just say that I think Johanna and I are equally and jointly confused about all this. But I think she's quite right.
Okay, maybe, all right. So if we have perhaps one more question, Ken, are you still intending to ask your question?
Well, I only wanted to make a very short remark about English language, since Joanna asked about it. And that is, especially in philosophy, English language is a mess. It's just a mess. And we have to beat it into subservience and clarity so far as we can. And the particular problem about representation, we got, unfortunately, at the handoff between roughly late medieval and early modern philosophy. Forget the read, right? At best, what we get is a recollection that is intellectual rather than having perceived something the first time. That too is only a gesture towards trying to get the terminology to behave itself. I'll stop there, and I hope allow Richard a chance to ask something more serious.
Okay, so the very last question indeed, Richard, please.
Well, mine was not so much a question as a comment. Lucas raised the issue as to what's the objective of all this discussion. I have to share misgivings about the word representation, but I think what is behind it is trying to give an account of how is it that we get things right, and as a distinct from getting things wrong. And the way I take up Mark's work is that the whole process, this is where I agree with Joanna Stone, it's the whole process program that provides, to my mind, a way of dealing with this that looks to be more fruitful than the dead ends that occupy most of the secondary literature, which seem to be going nowhere. That was my tuppence worth.
Just a small bit of history there. I've had process metaphysical intuitions from a long time that started to become explicit in the 60s. And I think I made mention to some of you that for 10 years or more, I had a little slogan that if I couldn't translate something into abstract machine theory, I didn't yet understand what I was trying to talk about. And I was using abstract machine theory as a very precise surrogate for process notions. But then, of course, it became clear that abstract machine theory was not adequate. I had to move to dynamic systems. And then it became very quickly clear that dynamic systems was also not adequate, because dynamic systems in and of themselves don't have any normativity. And so I ended up with this process framework dependent on far from equilibrium thermodynamics to try to explain normativity. But the process framework has been there in one form or another, however misinformed in early cases, from the very beginning.
If I could add a footnote, I've always, from when I was a young kid, thought of things in terms of processes. But it wasn't until I met Mark at a conference in Melbourne in 1989, I think it was, that suddenly here was a framework that gave me some way of articulating what otherwise were inchoate intuitions.
Okay. Excellent.
Ruta, I think
Ruth has
Ruta
comment?
pick one.
Is there a hand waving? What? Sorry, Jed.
Ruth,
I think
Ruth
yeah.
Milliken.
Yes, yes.
Just wanted to make a historical comment.
So you have even longer memories than Richard and Mark?
Yeah. Is that all right? If I
Sure.
Yes.
make a historical comment? Yeah. This idea that what's really central to the notion of representation that we really have to capture is the notion that of truth and falsity. It's very interesting, and that is that in the early 1980s, which is when I sort of entered this field, that was exactly what nobody was looking at. So it's kind of interesting. Apparently, it's not the thing that comes to the ordinary man's mind immediately, because these theories that were out there, Dretske and Fodor and Dennett, etc., all of them were simply ignoring that. None of them had account of what it would be for a representation to be false. So, but I absolutely agree with you, Mark, that is the center of things. But it's obviously not uppermost in people's minds to use the word representation.
Yeah.
Thank you. Plenty of material for us to take home with us. Thank you all for a wonderful session. And so we're going to take a refreshment for several minutes and follow up with a normativity panel and puzzles in the panel. 10 minutes, Jed, or what shall we say?
Yeah, let's take a 5-10 minute break. Everybody's here, so we can do this, right? Technically, we're starting late, but it won't matter. So everybody just come back in 5-10 minutes max, and we'll start the normativity panel. Thanks.
Is Alvaro here? Alvaro?
We can talk about it.
Alfredo?
Yeah, we can talk on chat.